As we talk about healthy small groups, we've said there were facets that you could see in a healthy small group. And so the first one was affinity, that people got together and connected over what they shared and had common ground about. And we also said that you needed consistency for a small group to grow. We said for it to really flourish, you would need transparency from the participants as well as people responding with empathy and care. Throughout this process, you begin to see people dialogue with one another, to really engage, where they're sharing their thoughts and feelings and hearing other people's thoughts and feelings. And I can't emphasize enough how important dialogue is. One of the deepest needs, desires of the human heart is to be known. We want to disclose to each other who we are, but we can only do that when we're in a trusting environment where we feel that our words will be acknowledged and heard, and also that we can be then safe enough to share. So in this process of sharing, of offering something of myself and then listening to something of yours, we become connected to one another in community. We start to feel a part of something, that we are not alone. This is a desperate desire of the human heart, a need to love and be loved by other people. Which is why dialogue is so crucial. It's how we get there. We talk to other people and listen to other people, and relationships grow. But dialogue's not easy. In fact, it often requires a lot of work to think through, how am I going to listen well? And I've already made other videos about some of the difficulties in listening, and how am I going to speak well of myself? But how do you facilitate dialogue in a small group? How do you make sure that this is happening? Well, some of the things that you do in dialogue interpersonally between two people apply. But then there are other things you start to add when you start talking about small groups. So let me give you some basic things that I think are necessary for small groups to dialogue with one another effectively. The first one is that you're going to have to ask really good questions. By asking good questions, you actually define the space that you're going to talk about. Tonight, we're going to talk about what we're struggling with, or tonight we're going to work on this, or today in this meeting we're covering this project. You define the space by saying, so let's talk about this particular thing. Where are we at on this project? See, I defined the space. What are we struggling with? You define the space. By essentially drawing the circle that you're allowing people to enter in, this questions now make sense. What do I mean? Well, one of my favorite questions to ask people is, what's your favorite kind of pie? Go ahead, tell me, I'll listen. Good. Now, what I want you to notice is this. You didn't say shoe or house or beetle. Why? Because those aren't pies, although if there is a beetle pie, I don't think I want it. The question drew the circle. It told us what we were talking about. So in small groups, the questions that we ask are really important to facilitate the dialogue that's going to happen among people. Well, okay, great. Practically, how do I ask good questions? Let me just give you one simple suggestion. Ask questions to other people that can't be answered in one word. What do you mean? If your question that you're about to ask somebody can be answered with yes, no, true, false, or even I asked you the question about pie. It's not a great question in some ways, well, partly because we're on video and I can't really hear you. But it's not a great question because if I said, what's your favorite pie? You could only respond with apple or one word. Instead, if I asked you a question like, do you remember the first time that you had pie? Or do you remember the first time you had your favorite pie? Now, what would happen? You might be able to say yes, but I'm drawing out of you a story. Or even better, tell me the story about the first time you ate your favorite pie. See what happened? I can't answer your question with one word. And the more I can get you to answer in a sentence or a paragraph, the more you develop that skill of asking questions that draw those longer answers out of people, the better the dialogue gets, because they'll want to nuance their answer instead of simply saying apple, pecan. Those are your favorite pies? Okay, but I want more from you. For dialogue to happen, you're going to have to ask really good questions. The second thing you're going to have to do, as with any dialogue, is listen carefully. Listen to what people are saying. But don't just listen for their answers. Listen to see what are they feeling, what are they thinking. Watch their nonverbal communication. They're saying a lot with their body and with their face. What are they saying? Pay attention to those things. And a practical tip on this discussion, I guess, in trying to think through how to listen, I want to say something here about small groups, which seems to be lost often, and that is that silence is okay. In a discussion, in a dialogue, we think we have to fill every minute with talking. But sometimes someone shares something in the middle of a group or in the middle of a work project that you just need to sit there with for a moment, to just be quiet and allow everyone in the room to reflect on what was just said, because it may be an extremely powerful moment, and you trying to fill it with words may run over a critical moment for your small group to be transparent and empathetic, to think very clearly about how they're going to respond, to reflect on their own thoughts and feelings about what was just said, because now it applies to them. If you rush over silence, you may miss a crucial moment for your small group to really, truly grow. You don't have to fill every moment. Now, does that mean I should just sit in silence for 10 minutes? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying don't be afraid of it. Silence is not only just a part of a conversation, it actually can be the moments where a small group grows together. All right, so what else? If you've asked good questions and you've listened carefully, then you got to start thinking through, okay, now I've got to respond. And you can seem to respond in one of two ways. The first one would be to summarize or paraphrase what you just saw and heard. This person just said something. Reflect back to them. So I'm hearing you say this, and it sounds like you're angry about that. Is that true? But here's my suggestion in this direction. Make sure that when you paraphrase or summarize, you do it tentatively. It sounds like why? Because then the person can say, no, I'm not really angry, or no, I'm actually really happy, or oh, that's not really bothering me as much as it just made it sound. Give them the opportunity to reply and reflect back, because sometimes they're processing it with you. So when you summarize or paraphrase to a person, make sure that you do it in a way that's tentative, because you're seeking to understand them and not simply put them in a box, tie a ribbon on it, and hand it back to them quick. The other concern I have when you're summarizing or paraphrasing something is that you don't actually get into a bad habit of parroting. What do I mean by that? Well, a parrot only says what you told it to say. So if you're sitting in a small group and someone says, I'm angry, and you look at them and say, you're angry. I just said I was angry. Why do you keep saying what I said? You can say, well, it sounds like you're angry because this happened. Okay, see, now I'm paraphrasing it and I'm offering a tentative possibility. Or you can actually do the other thing, which is ask a follow-up question, ask a clarifying question, and ask really good clarifying questions. Why? Because if you ask really good clarifying questions, it proves that you listened to what the person said in the first place. You say, well, I'm just going to respond with a regular set of questions. This is just the next question on my list. I understand what you're saying, but for really good dialogue, you have to take into account what the participants, the people around you are saying, and not just follow a script. I'm not saying blow the questions off that you got to get through. I get that. But for really good dialogue, for trust to grow, you're going to have to listen to the people and ask them good clarifying questions. So you said that. Is that something that's been going on for a while? Or is that something you've been struggling with? Or is that something you consider a strength? See, the clarifying question was based on what they just said. I'm trying to dig deeper into it and show that I care. But as you do that, sometimes in a small group, and you may be able to, you obviously do these things in interpersonal relationships. You can do them one-on-one. How can you help use good clarifying questions to actually facilitate dialogue among a group? So here's a practical suggestion for that I've used on a regular basis and seems to work fantastic in almost every single group I've used. If you're facilitating a small group discussion, or even in one, you know the people in the room who are considered extroverts, the people that talk a lot. And if you ask a question, they'll be the first people to answer it. That's great. But when I said before that you need consistency of engagement, if you're trying to facilitate that consistency of engagement, here's my practical suggestion. The extroverts are going to answer your questions, but the introverts may still be wrestling through it or not sure what to say. So what I tend to do is I say, here's the question. The extrovert answers it. I think we should do this, 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 and this. And I look at one of the introverts sitting in my group with me and say, what do you think about what they just said? Now they're not responding to the question, which may feel a little direct and a little difficult for some of them to answer. They've already had somebody who said something, so now they can agree or disagree, but now their answer doesn't feel so direct and personal, because for introverts, sometimes that's a difficult space to get to just be that transparent. But now they're reflecting on, well, I agree with that, but I think this is different. Or for me, that would be the same, but I actually would disagree about this thing. Or actually, I agree with them with everything they just said, because that's exactly my experience with this thing. What just happened? I allowed them to respond to another person instead of responding directly to the question. So I often note in my small groups, who are the introverts? Who are the people less likely to talk? And I invite them to respond to something someone else has said, because now they can nuance their answer off of the original answer from the extrovert. The last thing I want to encourage is that you just push your group all the time, as much as you can, to tell stories. I love storytelling. And you say, well, yeah, that sounds fun. We'll just tell stories. I think you miss the power of storytelling in a small group if you don't understand what it does. And if you want to see it in action, I'll give you a simple exercise you can do right now or the next time you're with your small group. Just do this. Tell a story and watch what happens. You tell a story about a time that you were a little kid and you fell off your bike. Watch what happens. Just let it sit for a second. And I can almost always guarantee you that one other person in the room will then tell you a story about a similar or the same thing. Just leave it for a second. The next person will tell a story that's similar or the same to the person who just told it. What's happening? You're creating what I've called a story chain, that each person adds a story to the link, a link to the story, and it just keeps going. And you create this chain, this link of connections that actually brings you together, that bonds you and connects you in ways that just saying pieces of information, ideas, abstract concepts don't do. The stories, because we're willing to disclose them to one another, actually increase that trust and link us to one another. So, as much as you can, in your asking questions, in your responses, in your summaries, tell stories. Because the stories open up spaces for people to understand the things that you're saying and understand the questions in new ways. And also invite them into telling their stories. As people start telling their stories, they feel known. As they begin to engage in these further and deeper dialogues that are based on transparency and empathy, they begin to open up and feel more known. And the more known we feel, the more we trust one another, the more we speak and encourage one another, the more your small group grows. Without this kind of dialogue, you will never have real progress. Dialogue is the ground for all progress and growth in any type of relationship going forward, because without it, relationships tend to atrophy. If one person spends all the time talking, the trust goes down and the person tends to drift away. But as the group continues to engage in strong and healthy dialogue by asking good questions, by listening carefully to one another, by asking follow-up questions or summarizing and telling each other its stories, you begin to see the power of dialogue to transform a small group, a work team, into all that it could possibly be.